In this episode of Deconstructing Comics, Coombe talks with Stephen Gilbert, who is both a comics creator of the crime fiction series Colville and a comic shop owner of Fourth Dimension Comics and Games in Newmarket, Ontario, Canada. He talks about the difficulty he has with drawing horrific sequences in his comic, the pages he doesn't want anyone to see, his approach to both drawing and publishing, and much more. First, I'd like to thank our patrons for keeping this show going. Join them at patreon.com/deconcomics. We have a couple of Patreon extras coming soon that I'll talk about later in this episode. If Patreon isn't in your budget, you can also send a one-time donation of any amount via PayPal to donate@deconstructingcomics.com. We appreciate your support. This is Tim, and this is Deconstructing Comics.
This is Kim for Deconstructing Comics. I'm here with Stephen Gilbert, the author of Colville. I'm speaking to Stephen in Newmarket at his store, which is called?
Fourth Dimension Comics.
Cool. How long have you had the store?
Oh my, it'll be, I'm going into my 20th year of owning my own store. I opened in the spring of 1999. And previous to that, I had worked sort of in a part-time capacity for another local comic store for, my rough guess is about 12 or 13 years. So I know a couple of years ago I realized I was selling comics in retail for 30 years.
How do you feel about that? Do you feel...
I'm sure it's a huge disappointment to my parents, but otherwise I'm fine with it. I really don't have any other discernible job skills. I worked at this other comic book store, while I was in high school, starting out as a teenager, and other than as a kid having a local newspaper route, I have literally had no other gainful employment other than comic book retail. So so far so good.
That was my dream job when I was a teenager, because I would go into the comic book store and I would just be fascinated by the sight of those really colorful covers, regardless of the period, in bags on the wall. And
I have a standard line whenever, a customer's in and they say, this must be the dream job of all dream jobs. And I say, it's not all wine and roses. There's, there's lots of downsides to it also. And it's certainly very tricky, but I consider myself hugely lucky to be doing this.
I'm sure that's true. I was just thinking, though, that if I was, if my younger self was there today, and I would be looking at the rows of whatever is out now, and all the digitized, colorized, stylized stuff from the 90s on, none of that stuff would be appealing or inspiring. Well, there's very few exceptions for me.
I certainly, my taste in comics, at least as far as mainstream comics goes, is relatively limited. I kind of came of age of comics as a reader, in the 1980s period where, I was really starting to follow alternative small press and underground comics. And it really kind of left my interest in, the big publishers kind of in the dust at the time. As a retailer, I have a bit of a responsibility to keep somewhat up to date on which X books are doing what to each other, or which version of a Crisis Rebirth is going on at the competition. But
do you read any of that stuff?
Very little. And,
but of the general storyline.
Oh, sure.
Or whatever's happening.
But very little of it is really very enticing to me.
Sure.
Every once in a blue moon, I'll see something which, strikes me as, this is the way I prefer to see more mainstream comics. I know, it's a little bit of a cliche to mention it at this point, but I think Matt Fraction did a Hawkeye series a few years ago.
Oh, sure, with David Aja.
Yeah, and I thought that was, closer to what I would like to see more, mainstream titles doing.
Sure.
I think Charles Soule had written a very short-lived She-Hulk comic like 4 or 5 years ago that I thought was very well done also. And, but it's largely stuff that I carry that obviously pays the rent and keeps the store afloat.
Yeah.
But most of my interest is much more in the margins of comics.
Sure, and we'll get to that in a minute, but I'd love to ask you a couple more questions about, because I never really get to interview a retailer. You just happen to be both an artist and a retailer. Do you have, my first question is, one, do you have much nostalgia for the stuff you were interested in prior to the early 80s?
I can usually wax a little nostalgic about, I have a soft spot for a couple of artists that when I was very young and starting to read comics, I remember picking up Captain America comics that were drawn by Mike Zeck.
I love Zeck.
He was one of the first artists where just walking down the aisles, I could see his style jump off of the cover of a book.
Yeah, for me, it was I'm a little bit younger than you, so it was the Punisher stuff that I think but when I read the Captain Americas, what's really interesting is you can really see him starting to come into his own, the progression of the signature Zeck style through that run. And what I find oddly interesting is I think the covers always had more of a sense of his kind of dynamism and robustness earlier than the interior work did. As a storyteller, he didn't really quite have that magic, especially in that period, but it does grow later on where he develops very strong dynamic styles and stuff.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And I mean, there's a few artists like that. I was a very big John Byrne fan in the early 80s when I got into comics, and it was probably the heyday of his mainstream comic career. And I read a lot of his Fantastic Four comics when I was probably, 12 or 13 years old.
Now, since we're both appreciators of art, and we've talked about art before, do you have any art by Zeck?
Oh, no, none at all. My collection of original artwork is bordering on non-existent. I think I own maybe 5 or 6 original pages of artwork. I have some friends who I actually years ago had a customer of mine who we started talking comics one day, and he was a relatively new customer to the store, and we started talking like Zeck, and this is a long time ago, but my memory is I helped broker a deal between him and a buddy of mine who collects original artwork, who happened to have some Mike Zeck pages that he ended up selling to the customer of mine. But no, my days of I think collecting original artwork are long gone. The prices are
astronomical.
I would have to get a second mortgage just to afford a handful of pages. So
yeah, I know. It's insane. Does having the shop kind of seep away the nostalgia and that kind of thing?
Well, when I opened the store, one of the sort of vows that I made to myself, one of my rules at the beginning was that I'm no longer a collector. I am a retailer, and I had worked in a store where one of the reasons I think the store had closed was the owner-manager of the shop had kind of become his own number one customer.
Right.
And it was, I think, the pitfall can be that a lot of the choice material that comes into the store, you're buying it, sure, you're buying it for less than retail because that's the nature of the beast. But then if you take it home and keep it in your collection, you're just headed for peril. And I vowed that was not my fate. And I divested myself entirely of my personal comic collection. That became, the collection of the store. And, I sold off so much of my own stuff that was, very near and dear to me. And I did break a little bit of that rule after I'd been open for a few years and was, becoming more established. I was able to go back and rebuy a small amount of that material that I just felt I wanted to have back in my my personal, collection.
I found personally that I'd be quite happy with just those collected trades that they started doing. At a certain point, they were fine substitutes for.
Well, and yeah, I mean, the only thing I kept out of the store at the time was, this was sort of single issue copies of comics that I was bringing in, but I already had a fairly large collection of, hardcover and paperback graphic novels. A lot of it, stuff that I had got signed by the cartoonists over the years, and so yeah, that was kept separate. And to this day, if I'm
it's
typically
personal.
Yeah, if I'm buying something for myself, it's going to be more of a graphic novel format than single issue comic.
The other question I was wondering is, what kind of clientele do you get walking into your store? Because of your interest, do you tend to attract people who are a bit more like you, or are you still just getting the mainstream?
Oh, it's very
fanboys.
Much a mainstream clientele. Most of the alternative comics, and I think for the size of my store and also, being out of a major metropolis, that I carry a ridiculously inordinate amount of small press and alternative comics. It's not like you would come into my store and there's a tiny little box in the corner with a couple of dog-eared, Fantagraphics titles from 6 years ago. It's certainly a big part of what I bring into the store.
Do you find that people buy it? Does it move?
Some stuff, and I mean, I find that there's a tremendous amount of hand selling that I do on those kinds of titles, and I try to identify, customers of the store that I think I can, start pushing into those corners of the art form, and I've always encouraged a view of my readership to look at comics as an art form and not, kind of a collectible type of item that they'll buy. And there's way more failures in those kinds of conversations that I have than successes, but it's always very gratifying when, a customer maybe turns a little bit of that corner and picks up, something that's out of their comfort zone.
Well, that leads me to an interesting question. Why Newmarket? I mean, wouldn't you be happier than in an urban metropolis where you get a lot more hipsters and people who are awake?
Well, yeah, I mean, the closest market like that, Toronto, is certainly very well served with, especially one comic book store that is, just amazing at that. And I mean, as far as Newmarket goes, I literally born, raised, and lived my entire life in Newmarket. It really is, my hometown. I feel a tremendous connection to the town. I really can't envision separating myself from it. And, when I opened the store, the opportunity was here. This was a market that previous to that had a comic book store for almost 20 years. And I knew that despite the fact that that store was going out of business, that there was more than enough of a clientele in this geography to support, a good, well-stocked comic book store. So, yeah, it didn't cross my mind for a second to open elsewhere. As a matter of fact, the store that I'd worked in that had closed down, I think one of the failures of that store was, even though it wasn't really doing very well from a business standpoint, the owner did attempt to open a second sort of satellite store, about 20 kilometers away in another community, thinking, I'm going to double my revenue by having a second store. And it was as colossal a failure as a person could ever imagine. I occasionally have remarked over the years that second store would have set the Guinness World Record land speed record for opening and then closing of a retail store. I think from doors open to doors closed, it was about 6 weeks. So, I mean, that's catastrophic. And I think that might have scared me off of any idea of, you know, franchising or other locations. I'm very happy to be a sole proprietor, old school, you know, little hole in the wall comic book store here in Newmarket.
Cool. I mean, you said that your parents might prefer if you did something else. Yet, I would think in this day and age, with the success of the Marvel movies, the fact that comics have become more mainstream, it would actually be a decent business to have. It's no worse than like owning a restaurant or something.
No, and I joke about that, but actually, as I was, you know, when I was younger and kind of growing into not just, you know, as a young person having an interest in comics and reading them and then drawing them, they were actually incredibly supportive of that and really actively participated in sort of my life as not just a young person consuming comics. You know, my dad would drive me to comic conventions in Toronto. He would actually take carloads of myself and friends, you know, all over the GTA visiting comic stores. And then when I was, again, very young and starting to draw comics and had an interest in cartooning, I never had to ask for pads of paper and pencils and pens. They were just always there and available. So, and then when I, you know, years later working in a comic book store, I kind of got that job because my dad knew the owner of the store, and he kind of got me the job there initially. And when the time came years later and I was opening my own store, my father, he's retired now, but he's actually like a financial planner and advisor. So it was great to have him around as somebody, like a sounding board about, finances and business and so on.
Did you know that you wanted to make comics from a very young age?
I wouldn't have had any kind of plan at a young age. I drew constantly as a young child. Like, I'm thinking, you know, from the age of 6 or 7 that I was drawing a lot. And it was always cartoony stuff. When I was very young, it was probably more with an ambition or an interest in animated cartoons. I was pretty obsessed by Bugs Bunny cartoons when I was that age, and I drew a lot of that sort of imagery. I think by the time I was maybe 8 or 9 years old, my parents had bought me my first Spider-Man comic, and previous to that, like I say, it was more like Looney Tunes and Disney kind of comics, which I'd already realized that was not of much interest to me. But that first Spider-Man comic, it was like, this is where my mind went to after that. And but even then, I wasn't drawing my own comic books per se. I was just kind of learning to noodle around with that kind of imagery. And I think even as I got to be, this comic book store at Newmarket, it would have opened up when I was about 9 or 10 years old, and I was going there at that age buying comics. But most of what I was drawing was, you know, I remember going through a period for a couple of years where I drew lots of like horror movie characters. I loved drawing werewolves and monster faces and stuff like that. And, I drew a lot of pictures of ninjas. And, but it probably, you know, I think by the time I was getting to about high school age is when I really seriously started thinking that, you know, comics could be a career option. And I spent several years kind of in my first couple of years of high school that I really wanted to draw mainstream Marvel and DC comics. And I devoted a huge amount of time to, drawing Spider-Man and Batman stories that really didn't go anywhere.
Were they imitations of what you were reading at the time?
It was, and I can think back and slowly, I remember starting to read things that were a little bit more, independent and alternative comics. I remember a comic that probably when I was about 14 was a pretty big revelation at the time, was the Matt Wagner Grendel comic book. And again, it's basically a mainstream superhero comic, but, a little bit more PG-13 R-rated than, say, Mike Zeck Captain America comic.
Sure.
And I became sort of obsessed by Grendel comics for a period. And one of the things that I realized was, Matt Wagner was hiring different artists to draw each story arc. And I had a huge ambition to become a Grendel artist. Like I drew a 25 or 30 page Grendel comic in high school that at the time, I think even looking back on it later, it was, remarkably professional in a sense. And I never sent it to Wagner. I totally would have chickened out as far as actually sending it to him. And it was not professional enough in the sense that it ever would have led to a job offer, but I was very happy with it at the time. I thought it was a major progression for me.
Did you see your storytelling improve, or were you just focusing on the art and the rendering?
I think that, it became a little bit, more ambitious than anything I'd attempted at the time. It was basically a dopey action comic, but it certainly, I think, as far as an action comic goes, kind of escalated the scenery and throughout the story. It zipped through the story, I think, pretty efficiently. It was, I think, a very important step for me to be able to sit down and, over the course of about a couple of months, produce a finished, penciled, inked, and lettered comic book like that.
Did you ever meet Joe Matt? He went to school with Matt Wagner.
Oh yeah. Over the years, at many of the old school comic conventions in Toronto.
What's old school for you, like 80s or 90s?
Like late 80s into the early 90s. There used to be occasional conventions that were held at sort of the old Ontario College of Art before it was OCAD. It's the little OCA school. They used to do, every few months there would be pretty cool little comic conventions held out of there. And they would actually get a few big name mainstream guys in, but of course it was all the local guys. I know, Chester Brown and Joe Matt, that would have, I'm sure, been the first place I met those guys and had some books signed by them.
But by that time, you were probably, like, Grendel was way in your rear view.
Well, no, it was still kind of part of, there was a period probably for 2 or 3 years where, I was just absorbing everything. I was still reading some mainstream comics, but it seemed like every month I would discover, 2 or 3 or 4 new cartoonists to get into their stuff. And, I think there was a period, though, where I had, and this was before I'd seen any really, truly alternative and underground comics. I can distinctly remember seeing an interview with Chester Brown on television, and I had never seen his artwork before. I had no idea who it was. And in the interview, they were in his apartment, and they were kind of filming him as he was drawing and inking some pages of Yummy Fur. And something just exploded in my brain when I saw that artwork. And I had this realization that was the best cartoonist I had ever seen. And I was kind of upset with myself because, he was so close. Like, this guy's in Toronto, and I have no idea who it is, but this is the best comic book that's ever been made, was what my brain was saying to me. And that was a real, I think, just an entire awakening as far as the art form of comics, was discovering Chester's Yummy Fur comics. And that was, like, say, a huge turning point for me.
And when did you start doing your own comics? Was this after you were into all the indie stuff?
Well, like I say, I was drawing comics in high school, and fairly.
But you weren't really publishing them, right?
No, it was just for, myself. My classmates would see them. I actually had a couple of very encouraging high school art teachers who, I felt like my job was to try to impress them.
Yeah, you said that the art teacher in the first chapter of Colville is based on you.
He is. He's one of a couple of really good art teachers that I had in high school. And yeah, he does make a cameo in Colville. But I think there was a period when I finished high school and I decided I didn't want to go to college, that I was just going to keep working in this comic book store and try to draw comics and learn the craft of comic book making. Still at the time, my idea was, I knew that there was no money in alternative comics, so I thought I have to try to get a job working for, say, Marvel or DC. And I think at the time my thought was that, I could probably get a job inking books for them.
Because you didn't feel strong enough about it.
I didn't think I had any interest in sort of creating stories for them, and even penciling something would be, I think you would need such a connection to the characters in those type of stories to do the penciling, because it's...
So would this be the late 80s, early 90s you're talking about?
This would have been, this would have been 1989, 90, 91, right. 92, in that period.
Right.
And like I say, I was working in this comic book store and, earning a few dollars doing that. I was saving a bunch of money. And somewhere in that period, I did start making, photocopied mini comics. And I did a small handful of mini comics. The best of those was a fake biography of the actor Luke Perry from Beverly Hills 90210.
Oh, sure.
I did a comic. It was called Luke Perry Confidential, and it was a tell-all biography of the downfall of him.
Well, was it subversive in that kind of post-punk, early indie comics kind of way?
It was, it was just nonsense is really what it was. It was very, very roughly drawn. I drew it, I think, directly in ink without any pre-planning. It was just kind of made up on the fly. And then, there was a few other odds and ends in there. A friend of mine that I had known for years through the comic book store, I had never heard him express an interest ever in making comics until one day, out of the blue, he came into the store, and of course he knew that I wanted to make comics, and he had drawn and had already submitted a Spider-Man submission to Marvel Comics. And I mean, this just blew me away. Like, where did this guy get off making a comic when, he had never talked about it?
He'd actually written for Marvel, or he applied to it?
He created his own, I think it was maybe a 10 or 15 page Spider-Man comic, and he was submitting it to them, trying to get work.
And you hadn't contacted Marvel about trying to be an inker or anything?
Never at all. Now, like I say, his comic was absolutely terrible, and he knew it, and he did get a rejection letter. That was sort of what he was bringing in, was he was showing me the rejection letter that he got. But he also had started working on his own personal project. He had this ambitious plan, almost like Dave Sims' Cerebus style, to publish a multi-year, 100-issue, self-published adventure comic. And he had the first issue of that completed. And he was already in the stage where he was contacting printers, and he had, I think, been in contact with Diamond about having them carry his self-published comic. And it sort of, it was a real kick in the pants to me, where I realized that, I needed to start making some comics for real at that point. and it was kind of at the urging of this friend of mine. His name is Jason Williams, and he had done a comic book totally. Sorry?
Was it the Under Terror comic book?
It's called Under Terror. It is totally lost to the ages at this point, and I think he self-published 6 issues of it over the course of about 2 years.
And all on his own dime.
Oh, totally, yes. It was like all self-published comics, it was a huge money drain over the course of about 2 years. And, eventually you have to realize that the plug has to be pulled on that project. So he has since been retired from comics, and but he was really encouraging of me to put something together, and it was really because of him, I think, pushing me into it that I did create some comics and self-publish them back in the 90s.
And I read an interview where you describe these comics and they're sort of very abstract, or they're very kind of off the wall.
They are, and I don't generally, I don't have them available anymore for sale. I still have a couple of boxes of them in storage. It started out as a comic series. It was called I Had a Dream, and it was basically nonsensical, surreal, dreamlike action adventure stories of, mostly wordless or, very little dialogue, just characters kind of wandering through an abstract geographical environment. I was kind of playing around with just storytelling tricks and techniques and trying to learn how to, tell a story for 24 pages or 48 pages. And, but I'm not, I don't really have much of a connection to those stories anymore. And so I don't, maybe I just don't think too highly of the work in hindsight.
Sure.
It was more of a learning experience that maybe I shouldn't have published those comics, but I did.
I may be reading too much into it, but it almost feels to me like just now you were more passionate about the Grendel project.
Oh, no.
Those.
No, I mean, I think I look at the Grendel project with personal bemusement in hindsight. And certainly the books that I self-published were infinitely better than the Grendel comic that I had drawn. And it was kind of a learning process. I was trying to figure out how to tell a story over more and more extended chunks of pages. And, the first few issues that I did were 24-page self-contained issues. And then I think I did one that was a 2-issue story that was 48 pages. And I know somewhere in there, I think I started looking at stories more as a 48-page thing than a 24-page thing. They became a little bit more ambitious. And it was kind of in that period also that Colville started formulating in my head. I had known about the true story, the actual events that had occurred that inspired the comic, and I knew that I wanted to make a comic of that story, but I didn't feel like I had the chops to do it properly.
Well, that was one of the questions I had prepared. So why did you want to do those stories? And for listeners, Colville is about intersecting people in a small town, which you fictionally named Colville, and there's some murders there are murders and grisly stuff that happen, and we'll get into that in a moment. But why did you pick those stories to coalesce your project around?
The actual Colville stories themselves?
No, the stories in the newspaper.
I Had a Dream stuff.
No, the Colville stories that came from the newspapers.
Well, when it was occurring, I've always liked crime fiction. Some of my favorite writers are crime fiction writers. I like small town regional stories. I like stuff that's kind of about a place and maybe reveals something about that place. I was also a huge fan of the From Hell comic book, and
I noticed there's a poster in the comic book store in your book. Like I said in my review, you really wear your influences on your sleeve, and that's quite nice. That's not a bad thing. It's quite enduring because many of my likes are from the same period. And so when I saw that poster with the hat and the grapes, I was like, I love that.
Well, one of the things that I was trying to do too early on was, I had this idea, and before the story was called Colville, before I called the town Colville, I was just going to set it in the real town. It's called Keswick, Ontario, that the actual sort of motorcycle crime element took place in.
Well, how similar is it, if you don't mind my asking, to what happened in Colville?
Well, the skeleton of it is based on some real events. There is a real sort of true crime story of high school kids stealing dirt bikes and failing miserably when it came to trying to fence and sell them. And then one of the individuals, had a pretty tragic end to his life because of, he tried to sell the bikes back to the person that he had stolen them from.
And like in the book, was the owner of the bike in a biker gang? Yeah.
Well, this is going to sound terrible, but my memory of any of that was, as far as I know, probably more of a fantasy on my part.
Right.
I think that there might have been a reference that he had been in a biker gang, but it was not. I mean, that's entirely imagined on my part. The backstory that I give him in the comic is completely made up.
Yeah, that grizzly. If you don't mind, I hate that term. No spoilers. So we'll just talk about it as if people have read it or will want to read it, knowing what happens. So if you don't mind, I'll say what happens.
Sure. Better you than me. It's horrific.
Yeah, that's a good point.
That scene, which involves a couple of bikers getting reprisals. This is in a flashback to one of the characters, and it's revealed that his family is the victim of sort of a biker gang reprisal where the character's wife is killed. The house that they're living in is burned down, and in the process of killing the wife, the biker gang members they skin her.
One of them wants to take back their colors.
They do. They carve out the piece of skin on her back that has the biker gang tattoo.
And she passes out and presumably dies. Do you know medically if that would happen in that situation?
Well, all I know is that came from, I read as research a couple of books on actual biker gangs, and that was one of the more grisly descriptions of something that they would do. If a person ran afoul of them, they would come and collect their colors. And
wow,
that was.
And this isn't a bike gang we would recognize, like the Rock Machine or something like that.
It was, and I was actually in the process of researching the book. I did through actually my brother knew a guy who he was, I think, a part-time reporter, and he had done some writing for the Globe and Mail on biker gangs. And so my brother arranged for him to provide me with a little bit of like background material. And when he discovered I was going to be putting this actual biker gang into the comic book, he flat out said, you never want to do that because biker gangs don't like their representation in stories like that. So I fictionalized the name of the biker gang in the comic book. I thought, this guy knows what he's talking about. And if he's telling me not to include any real names, then I better not do that.
Right. In the story, to me, what's interesting about that moment is Adam, who's the biker or the ex-biker in that flashback, I can't tell, is sitting on his bike, and he seems to be sort of reveling in his identity as part of the gang. So to me, it didn't seem like he was out of the gang.
Yeah, my feeling was that he was, stepping away from the biker gang, and he's now a family man, and for whatever reason he's shirked whatever duties he's got to the biker gang, and there's obviously some kind of unspoken and unshown element to whatever they're pissed off about. And
which we never know, really.
Yeah,
it doesn't matter.
It's really, yeah. I mean, that flashback was really just meant to be kind of a sliver in the story, and obviously it's certainly an undeveloped element of the narrative, but
it shows how hardcore Adam is.
I think it was really meant to show kind of the grisly background that it come from.
Yeah. And then you got Paul Bernardo in there.
Paul Bernardo committed a string of rapes and murders in Scarborough, Ontario between 1987 and 1992.
Oh, geez, I know.
And if you're okay talking about it, because I have so many questions about that, but I'm guessing that you were doing the first chapter when that stuff was coming out in the news. And if you don't mind, I didn't get to mention this in my review, but I guess a lot of people have a Bernardo sort of story connection or whatever, and I have a couple.
Yeah, and I mean, at that point, when I was working on the comic, it was actually well after the actual true crime that the story is based on occurred in the very early 90s, and I was working on the comic. I think it was more like 1995 or 96, so time had passed. Bernardo was captured and arrested and in jail at that point.
But you were obviously fascinaed by the case.
I don't want to say fascinated. I mean, repulsed by it and kind of sickened by it. And yeah, I think like a lot of people in Southern Ontario at the time, there was times where I felt, I don't want to say a connection to any of the events in reality, but, it's my understanding that, Paul Bernardo, after he was arrested, his lawyer was from my hometown of Newmarket, that there was stories that he would, and I mean, I don't know how much of this is, mythology at this point, but there was stories that he would go to, say, public shopping malls and follow girls around with his camera, and he called it trolling. He would go trolling in public places. And that one of the places that he apparently did that was the large shopping mall that's here in Newmarket. I don't want to get too detailed about it, but after, I think it was during the Scarborough, when he was unknown, and it was during the Scarborough rapist period, that a family member of mine was walking home from school here in town and was in kind of it was a public park area, but kind of remote area of that park. And she was confronted by somebody who was inviting her into the bushes. And she was able to, she's fairly athletic and was, I guess, fairly easily able to run and dodge around this person. But when she cleared the area, she realized that the person had there was a vehicle waiting with somebody else in the car. So there was little things like that kind of, they were fermenting in my imagination. Now that incident had nothing to do with Paul Bernardo, but that wasn't Paul Bernardo.
No, it some
wasn't,
other abductor.
Of course, she got home from school and was tremendously upset. And of course, when my mom was able to find out what had happened to her, that the police were called, a report was made, and of course, everybody, I think people were just on edge that stuff like that was happening. So there was a lot of little things like that kind of, I guess, maybe percolated away.
Yeah, I can see how that would capture your imagination.
Well, and, of course, there was the whole publication ban at the time on Bernardo's trial, and there was so much information that was unknown, and you would hear rumors of stuff that had happened that were just jaw-droppingly grotesque. And I know finally after the case was resolved and it was over, I remember reading one of the books that was written about the case. I think it was called Lethal Marriage. And, it was 100 times worse than I could have imagined anything that you'd heard in rumors or whispers or whatever. It was just a flat-out nightmare.
Just to go back to the person in the car waiting and then the other abductor, that happens in your book. Paul Bernardo is aided and abetted by his partner Carla, and she waits in the car, and he then, captures Tracy and blah, blah, blah. But are you saying that Bernardo and Homolka didn't do that was just something you kind of invented for the purposes of your story with them?
Oh yeah, the actual involvement of them in the Colville story is 100% fiction.
Okay.
It is.
See, I don't know enough about their operations.
No, I call it irresponsible fiction. That when I was working on, Colville was originally, I did publish about the first 64 pages of the graphic novel, which is about 200 pages in total. But the first 64 pages I had published back in the late 90s as just a self-contained one-off 64-page comic. And at the time, I kind of thought that was maybe all I would do with it. There was a period while I was drawing it that, when I introduced Bernardo as a character into it, I have, and to this day, I have very mixed feelings about doing that. But it started to give me this idea that there was more to the story than those 64 pages, that it opened up this possibility of showing other angles to not just this dirt bike theft and, ending of that story, but it would almost be this tangent point for 2 or 3 other stories to kind of intersect with it. And certainly, if you're putting somebody like Paul Bernardo into the story, it opened up this, idea of developing that further in, a later chapter of the story.
Sure. Well, you sort of answered a question I was having, which is this is not really then the historical Paul Bernardo and Homolka. I always wondered why you made Homolka so submissive.
Carla Homolka was Bernardo's wife and accomplice.
I'm not really sure. Obviously, the evidence tends to bear out that she was an incredibly willing and active participant in those crimes, and
she would also get pleasure from them.
Well, certainly, and I like I say, I don't want, or I don't think in my mind that the representation of them in the comic book is not meant to be a documentary of the two of them. Is
it like changing the biker gang name? Is it like kind of distancing yourself from the real people just to avoid?
Well, I was very troubled by the inclusion of them, and I'm not sure. I felt like I wanted to include that material, and part of the reason why there was such a huge gap between that initial Colville comic and then, 15 years later completing it as a graphic novel was because I really didn't like the idea of what I thought the conclusion would have to be. I had a very clear image in my head of how the story would conclude, and it was so ugly that I didn't want to draw it. And, I think a big reason why I didn't do much cartooning for such a long time was because I wasn't interested in drawing any other comics other than Colville, but I felt myself incapable of drawing that conclusion to the story.
Generally, it's not like you had a purpose you'd worked out. Like, I want to do a comic about this because I want to express this. It was more just you had these images in your mind. And
I work in an entirely intuitive process. I don't write any script. I really don't even write any notes as to what will be happening in a story.
It sounds like you're not even thinking about what you want to say with your work.
Well, I hope that that anybody who reads my work can determine for themselves what they think is being said. But I don't think I would have anything too profound to add to anybody's interpretation of what the material is.
But maybe your technique is what lends the book its vitality or its, strangeness, because it's not
I've always liked
typical.
I've always liked that method. That method of drawing a comic works for me because it allows for so many little accidents to come up in the story. So many little bits of inspiration can lend themselves to the story. And, I work out the dialogue as the page is being drawn. I'll know in my head, I can hear the dialogue between the characters. And quite often, once I've got the page penciled, I will draw the dialogue on a separate piece of paper just so that I can imagine how that wordplay would go back and forth. But nothing is really finalized until I'm putting the ink onto the paper. I'll change dialogue at the stage that I'm inking the lettering. And,
but what about like breakdowns of a page or pacing? Do you kind of try to control
none of that? I don't do any.
It just comes out like.
Well, usually what I'll do is I'll decide ahead of time what kind of panel structure I like. And I've always liked comics that are a bit more of a grid structure.
Yeah, I can see that.
And I think that, one of the things I took from, say, reading a lot of Chester Brown's comics was he often would work in a 6-panel grid. And I really liked that. And my entire, storytelling and pacing technique comes down to deciding what the panel grid is going to look like on the page.
Yeah, I think that pacing, which is fairly common, it's almost like a graphic novel style. It sort of just instantly lends the pacing a kind of stately, kind of an unhurried kind of thing that puts it in a certain category of the literary graphic novel.
Right.
Would you agree? Or?
Oh, I hate the term literary graphic novel.
I know. I'm just trying to peg it.
I try to be as far on the wrong side of the tracks of the literary graphic novel as I can imagine. And but I do know what you mean. That I guess any of my storytelling considerations, they're certainly not put on the page for maybe overly commercial considerations. It's there's not really any of that goes into my thought process as I'm working on it. And whatever pacing is there, I don't think I could ever describe how I end up with that pacing. It just seems like, I really will think about the page quite a lot, and I'll think about the story a lot before I start drawing it. And I mean, some of my comics I've had percolating in my head for, sometimes 10 years or whatever before I draw them. So I can really imagine the flow and the pace of the story and how long certain sequences are. And so when it finally comes time to draw the pages, working within that grid structure allows me to, I think really move that pacing along at the style that I'd like to.
Yeah.
Coming up, the source of the title, I Had a Dream, drawing horrific sequences, Stephen's approach to drawing and to publishing, reproducing movies in comics form, and more. First, just a reminder that you can help this podcast by making your Amazon purchases via deconstructingcomics.com/Amazon and make that your bookmark for future purchases. We'll then get a percentage of what you spend. It costs you nothing extra and helps us cover web hosting and the other costs of presenting this show every week. We really appreciate your support.
Are you willing to follow me on a journey and risk getting lost in a swirling maze of past ages, protected only by our red indestructible capes as we break through the final unexplored realm of the time barrier to explore the fantastic Silver Age adventures of the world's greatest hero, Superman? If so, join me each week on the Superman Fan Podcast, as together we'll follow the Man of Steel, his cousin Supergirl, and his closest friends, Perry White, Lois Lane, Jimmy Olsen, Lana Lang, Batman and Robin, and others in Superman's never-ending quest to defend truth and justice in the pages of Action Comics, Superman, World's Finest Comics, Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen, and Superman's girlfriend Lois Lane. Go to the supermanfanpodcast.blogspot.com, available on iTunes and most other podcast aggregators. You can also follow the podcast on Facebook, Twitter, Tumblr, Medium, Flipboard, and Stitcher. And after you listen, feel free to send email to supermanfanpodcast@gmail.com. And unless you request otherwise, I look forward to reading your comments on future episodes. And don't forget to wear your red indestructible cape, standard safety equipment for traveling through the time barrier.
Just going back to drawing those sequences, those horrific sequences, once you got down to drawing them, did you find them very hard? How did you process that?
Well, what had sort of happened is I had gone away from cartooning for a long time. When I opened the store in 1999, I at the time thought I'll take a break from cartooning. I had drawn the 6 I Had a Dream comics. I had drawn 2 other comics sort of related to that series. It was called Garden Back, and I had published the Colville one-shot. And my idea was that I would draw a second chapter of Colville.
Can I just ask a question I have to ask?
Sure.
The series that was called I Had a Dream, it sounds a little bit like it was like a dreamscapey, like, Rick Veitch's.
It actually, I was a big fan of the Rarebit Fiends comics, and especially Jim Woodring's Frank comics. They, in hindsight, are really, I think, informed what I was maybe stylistically trying to do.
But did you ever think, or was it intentional, that people might think of Martin Luther King's speech?
Well, I didn't necessarily at the time, because also that the title was kind of stolen from a Nick Cave song. It was called I Had a Dream Joe. And obviously any connection to, say, Martin Luther King or the Civil Rights Movement would have been immediately dispelled upon any, visual examination of the comic book.
Sure.
And I think that by the time I changed the name essentially to Garden Back, and it was basically the same comic under a different title.
Sure.
And I was aware, I thought, this I Had a Dream title is maybe not what I should be calling it. So I changed it and sort of went with this Garden Back title. I think if I were to ever do anything with that material, that it would be published under the Garden Back title as opposed to anything else.
Anyway, you were talking about doing those 3 things and then taking a long break.
Yeah, and it was opening the store. It was going into business for myself. And one of the things that I really didn't factor into that was just how much work it would be. And, initially I thought I'll take 6 months off to get the store up and running and then get back to cartooning. But it was so exhausting. I mean, running a business essentially by yourself. It was incredibly long hours. Needless to say, I had never worked that hard ever in my life, and it was just constant. And
this was in the late 90s when the bust happened.
It was 1999. Well, it was kind of during that I was opening the store. Like, it was there was no good news coming out of the business end of comics, and but like I said, I was confident in my ability to sell comic books, and to, I knew that there was enough of a marketplace here for me to do that. And much to my very happy satisfaction and surprise at the time, like, the store, it really did start out kind of running, and even within the first year, it was doing much better than I would have thought at that early on. But like I say, the downside as a cartoonist was there was no way I could sit at the drawing board and effectively make comics. It was just something that I put aside.
So just to kind of place where you'd gone to in terms of Colville, I guess the 64-page thing would have ended with David's murder at the hands of Adam, the biker.
It was. If somebody, I have a copy of the book here, and if somebody were to open up, minus some of the title pages and so on, that page 74 is where that initial comic would have ended.
Right.
So yeah, it was this main character David is sort of taken out of the picture at that point, and then everything beyond that was never published. Most of it was never drawn. There was a small amount of material that I had penciled and inked that makes up what's effectively the second chunk of the story, and but it was abandoned at that point. And
but did you know you were going to use the murder of David to tie, or like as the revolving post around which the story kind of circulated?
Yeah, that was always
that
kind of that was the central part of it. That was kind of the little thumbtack in the middle of the board where everything else would kind of come back to it, and other characters you would see the impact or their involvement with it, and that was always my intention, was that little street corner where the murder happened would things would come back to that. I didn't really know how much. It was just, like I say, kind of an idea that I was thinking about.
So even that was kind of intuitive, the structure of your book.
Oh yeah.
And the node around which it hinges.
Yeah, it was just I knew, but I didn't have anything really planned out other than this picture in my mind of how it would happen.
But that's part of what I liked about your book, was the kind of the charm of the strangeness of how it. I wonder if maybe it's kind of like, did you ever hear that Kafka would write his short stories by sort of going into a semi-trance when he came home from work? Do you think maybe it's like that?
I probably heard that, but my state wasn't like. I would actually go for a walk almost every day, walking home from the store. It was a 30 or 40-minute walk to get home, and that was mostly spent, thinking of stuff like, what am I going to do in this story? Like, what's going to happen? And I would kind of, fantasize the whole thing out as I was walking. And, most of the ideas for comic books that I've had have occurred while I've been, going for a walk around town.
Right. And I forget if you really answered, but when you did get to doing the sequences with the tortures of the Paul Bernardo victims, how did you kind of move through that? How did you? Because you sound even now conflicted about that.
Oh, I think it's I knew that was going to be the conclusion of the book, and initially I thought that I would accomplish that scene in maybe 10 pages. And like I say, I had read a couple of books about Bernardo, and I just did not relish the idea of trying to, obviously in a fictional way, but honestly portray how bad that stuff was.
And yet you're compelled to do it, right? Because it's a focus of the book.
Well, and I don't really have, an explanation of why. I actually tried to, at one point, I tried to veer the story away from that.
Uh-huh.
And I had actually drawn about a 25 or 30 page section that was about the police officers at the crime scene. And I thought that I could accomplish the Bernardo stuff in a more round, I really don't know, maybe a more roundabout way.
Did you finish that whole chapter?
No, well, I penciled it, and it was penciled and lettered, and I hated it. I just thought it was terrible, and I thought the whole presentation of the police officers was very phony, and I just hated it. I actually destroyed the pages.
Interesting. When you say you destroyed it, do you mean you threw them in a fire? Or?
No, I tore them up and I threw them in the garbage.
That's crazy. It's like that story without Columbia and big numbers.
Well, maybe that was part of what was in my head. I actually found, about 2 years ago, I found 3 or 4 of the penciled pages that I must have kept. I don't know why they would.
And how did they look to you now after all this time?
They're literally just like barely discernible, very rare, very loose pencils, and then, like say, the lettering is on the pages, but I really need to throw those pages out too. Is how I think about it when I
really. I think you should save them as a really interesting artifact.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I hate the idea of anybody discovering those artifacts someday.
Give them to me. I'll charge them.
What's that?
Give them to me. I'll charge them.
No chance. No way.
But just to come back to Bernardo, and forgive me, but it does seem like maybe you don't want to answer the question, but I'm wondering, how did you force yourself to sit down at the table and to delineate those things?
Well, I had sort of an opportunity a few years ago that kind of forced me back into cartooning. And I had been writing and drawing like zines and little short stories throughout the years, and I started self-publishing my own fake historical zine about Newmarket. I called it the Journal of the Main Street Secret Lodge. And I would handwrite and hand letter short stories that were, like I say, completely fictional about Newmarket. And I did those for a number of years. That was kind of my creative outlet for quite a few years. And I published 6 or 7 of those zines, and they became more and more and more ambitious as they went along. And at a certain point, I think this would have been in maybe 2012, I saw a reference to my comics online. And I was barely on the internet at the time. I didn't, I had literally just got the internet in the store. And a friend of mine said to me that you were mentioned on some website article, and I was like, okay, I don't know what that means, but he couldn't tell me where it was. And then I think it was the next day I was reading Heidi MacDonald's page, The Beat, and there was a link on there, and she said there's a cartoonist, Frank Santoro, who said that he had an article about cartoonists from the 1990s who had disappeared. And I thought, this has to be what my friend was talking about, and I'm going to freak out if I'm mentioned in this article. And I clicked on the link, and sure enough, Santoro made a mention of my Colville comic book, that he had liked it, but that it was just come and gone. And for some reason, that was man, somebody remembers my old comic books. I have to make more comics. I have to get back into it. And my initial foray back into comics making was I did a comic book of this Journal of the Main Street Secret Lodge. I took one of these historic adventure stories, and instead of writing it out as a prose short story, I drew it as a comic book. And I published it, and it actually opened up so many amazing doors and possibilities. Like I won a couple of awards for it, and I met so many amazing people. Even just setting up a TCAF, it became this whole amazing experience just by getting back into making a comic book. And one of the things that came out of it was people who had read my comics back in the 90s were asking about Colville, and could I finish that story? And over the years, I had got that artwork out many, many, many times with the thought of continuing to work on it. And, at this point, like I say, this is just a couple of years ago, I already had a very strong idea for another of the Main Street Secret Lodge comics. Like I knew what the second one was going to be, but I thought, people are asking about Colville, and it had always been something that occupied a lot of my thoughts about comics. And I literally I pulled the artwork out of my cupboard, and I started looking at it, and I thought, I am going to give this one last shot, that I'm going to sit down. And there was actually a page of artwork that was half, I literally got to that page and I'd left it half penciled. And I just flipped to that page and I looked at it, and whereas all the other times over the years I would look at that page and I would just put it back in the cupboard and never continue it, I sat down and I started finishing that page. And then it was just, okay, on to the next page. I'm going to keep going and keep going. And that was really it. It was like, okay, now I've started on it, and now I'm going to finish it. It was just kind of a resolve that I had to get it done. And I knew that part of that would be, kind of confronting this material that would be, the last 40 or so pages is what it turned out to be.
Mm-hmm. And was it easier to get through them once you started? Did it build up?
Oh, well, I mean, up until those 40 pages, it probably was really flowing along. But of course, I had a sense of dread of, where it was leading to. And, but I had convinced myself that I had to finish it, and I did. I don't have a lot of memory of, I actually have a copy of the book, and one of the things I also really wasn't sure how I was going to attack. I remember thinking about, I wanted to follow this thread of the story where the envelope goes through the mail system, and not having any idea of how I would visualize that.
Why did you have David draw Twilight of the Superhero?
Well, that's maybe the thing
that's what's in the envelope that you're talking about.
Yeah, and at the time that I was working on it back in the 90s, that was something that,
was fascinating. But it's at such disjunction with your book.
It is. It's too much of a comic book insider kind of thing. The idea that there's this unknown Alan Moore story, that the kid in the story who wants to be a comic book artist, he decides to draw his own version of it. And some of that stemmed from years ago, a friend of mine had downloaded a copy of, I don't even know if you still can, I'm sure it's available somewhere online, but Alan Moore had
a proposal.
Yeah, he had given a copy of that proposal to an interviewer who I think had just put it up online. And, I think it's about 20 or so pages of his written proposal. And I was kind of fascinated and obsessed by that proposal myself. So it was maybe a bit of a projection on my part of, I was putting myself into the shoes.
Oh,
of that
sure. Well,
character.
you know I'm a big Alan Moore fan, and there's a sort of fanboy part of you that goes, what if Alan Moore had stayed with superheroes like for the next 20 years, and what would he have produced? Like 5 more Watchmen, and
Sure. So it was like I say, that's maybe something where I wasn't thinking about what I was doing a whole lot, and I hope that readers who look at the book and have no idea what the backstory to that is, can accept that it's just some weird little fanzine idea, some weird little mini comic that this idiot kid was going to do. And, people kind of know who Alan Moore is, and I hope they get that there's, maybe if it encourages somebody to do a Google search for Twilight of the Superheroes, they'll get to read that proposal also.
Yeah, it's funny because I went looking for Under Terra because it was mentioned in your book, and I couldn't really find anything of that, and I didn't really know what it was until I read that other interview.
Yeah, I think that from my own Google searches, there are maybe 2 or 3, like if you do an image search for it, that you'll see a couple of the covers. And it really, like say, when my friend Jason was drawing and publishing Under Terra, it was entirely before any online world would have existed for something like that.
He's speaking of Jason Williams, who published at least 6 issues of the comic Under Terra in the 1990s through Pre-Dawn Productions.
And by the time he had sort of run its course over a couple of years, it's disappeared to this day. And I actually had lost touch with Jason for, the better part of about 15 years. And after I had published the Secret Lodge graphic novel and had some success with it, and I had decided, I'm going to attack and finish Colville. And one of the things that I wanted to do was to drive up to this town, Keswick, and do an afternoon, just drive around and kind of get reacquainted with the geography. The town has changed tremendously up there over the course of 20 years, but my girlfriend is from that area. So she took me on a little bit of a travel tour around it. We visited all the old sites that are in the first comic. But one of the things I wanted to do was, like I said, I hadn't seen Jason in about 15 years at that point. And I looked up his address, and he was living in a different house, but still in Keswick. And I dropped by his house that afternoon, and I gave him a copy of the Secret Lodge comic, and I told him that I was kind of back into the Colville environment, and it was a great, probably about an hour-long visit, and it was just a phenomenal thing to see him again, and get to see how his life has, gotten so great. And, he's definitely moved on from comics and cartooning. It's not a part of his life at all anymore. But I'm sometimes tempted to see if I could get him to give me, like, say, 20 copies of each of his issues of Under Terra. And that way, when I do comic conventions, I could throw it in as a freebie, I could say, this is a real comic and it exists,
and
here
it's in my book.
But I've never asked him to do that, so I have no idea if he even still has, maybe he shredded all the copies and used them as insulation. That was what he used to joke about wanting to do with his extra copies. So
yeah. What about your own life since Colville came out? Has your life changed a lot? Has it changed in certain interesting ways?
I don't think it's, I don't think it's changed a whole lot.
And how many years has it been since Colville came out?
Since the new edition came out?
Yeah, the collected one with the purplish sky on the front.
Yeah, I mean, it's only been, a couple of years really. It's, I got to look at the copyright dates. April of 2015.
But it did win something, didn't it? Like a Doug Wright or something?
They can't all be winners when it comes to the awards. It was, my first book, the Journal of the Main Street Secret Lodge, won a Schuster Award and a Doug Wright Award, which is kind of ridiculous to my mind. And then Colville was also nominated for a Joe Shuster Award for the year that it came out, and which, like I say, that sort of stuff is there really is no impact from any of those things happening. It doesn't lead to CBC profiles or
sales coming in and the
I think that it's nice when you're at a show like TCAF and you can have a little sticker that says, Doug Wright winner or Joe Shuster Award winner. It's a nice little thing to have. And I do have a tiny little trophy shelf that I keep at home, that I can look at them if I want to. But, there has been some really interesting things happen with the Colville comic book. There was a review of it a few years ago on the Comics Journal's website, and I went into the comments thread and I put a little note on it saying, hey, if anybody's interested in this book, send me an email, and I do mail order, and I ended up getting quite a few mail order requests, like maybe 25 or 30 of them because of that. And one of them was from a person in Italy who requested a copy. And it turns out this guy in Italy, he's a cartoonist, and he had been a huge fan of the comic from when it was published in the 90s.
Yeah, that's the article I read, the interview I read.
Yeah, and
because he's so enthusiastic about you, it's interesting.
It was kind of amazing because I found out that he had this, because the comic just disappeared in the 90s, and he always had a fascination with it.
Yeah.
And apparently one of the things he wanted to do was his own bootleg continuation of Colville.
Wow. Did you let him?
He could satisfy in his head what could have gone on in the story.
Did you let him?
Sorry?
Did you allow him to do that?
Oh, no, this was just, I think he sent me an email telling me about this. This was a couple of years ago. And what ended up happening is he showed the graphic novel Colville to another fellow in Italy named Gabriel DeFazio, who runs a company. It's called Just Indie Comics, and he sells North American alternative and underground comics to an audience in Italy, like people over there that want to read North American underground comics. He imports them and resells them. So he emailed me and asked if he could, buy wholesale a stack of my books, which I happily did. And suddenly I started building this little audience of readers in Italy.
That's amazing. But they love fumetti there. They love comics.
Oh, it's amazing. But the other thing that was amazing that sort of happened was this cartoonist, his name's Radiger, that's kind of his pen name. But I guess a couple of years ago, he took over co-editorship of a fairly large company in Italy called Coco Nino, a publisher in Italy. And I had actually received, it wasn't from Coco Nino, but it was another publisher in Italy had emailed me about trying to negotiate for the Italian rights to Colville. And I think I put a little jokey thing on Facebook about, hey, does anybody out there know how to negotiate international contracts? And what ended up happening was that publishing deal never came to pass. But this artist Radiger, he, I guess, was made aware of, I think it's a small community of alternative publishers over there. And when he found out that the one deal had fallen through, he contacted me again and said that his company, Coco Nino, would like to purchase the Italian rights to it. So, we talked a little bit, but I was more than happy to make a deal with them. So there is a publisher, like say Coco Nino in Italy, has published and printed an Italian translation of it. That's led to, I now have an agent. It's actually an agent that works for them and negotiates further, like international rights for their book.
Yeah.
So I've also signed with a French publisher to do a version of it in France, and I suppose doors are open to any other.
Congratulations! That's amazing.
It's amazing. Yeah, it's amazing to me. I think it's just mind-boggling
where it can travel to, and in such a specific, unexpected way, kind of like your creative process. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, it's one thing just sort of follows another, and so but I mean that really doesn't impact my life in any way. It has not led to any form of early retirement, which allows me to draw comics full time. It's just kind of a really cool thing that's happened to me, I guess.
Cool.
Hopefully more comes of it, but if not, I'm completely satisfied with where it's at right now. I mean, I'm
getting something translated into Italian, and I've never really had this experience before. It was an interview I did with Moore, our favorite Alan Moore, and this guy, what's really interesting is the guy who's publishing it, I assume he's a guy because of his name, which is Smoky Man. It might not be. I don't know. He contacts me, and nobody knows who this guy is, but he contacts me once in a while, and I'm presuming it's a he, and he says, and he sort of has a disguised voice, although more often it's the, just like Deep Throat from the, yeah. Okay, so he contacts me, and then he says, I'm putting together a very little book of interviews with Moore, translated in Italian, and I would like you to say yes to it. And I was like, I'm not making any money or anything off of this, but just the fact that it exists, and this very odd conduit, this guy who's as passionate about Moore as I am, or more so even, because he's published stuff about Moore, although nobody really knows anything about him. And so I have no contract with him, I have no idea where he is, I just take it on good faith, because in his communications he's sort of jocular, that that the translation will capture, in true spirit. I just take all of this on good faith. That'll come out at some point. And
that's about all you can really do is, hopefully, these people know what they're doing. And,
yes, one would hope so.
It's funny when I got back a couple of my author copies of the translated version. It's like, this book looks great. They really, the attention to detail in it is outstanding, and the cover stock, the paper, everything, it's really good. So, I have no problem with letting them run with it and do whatever they need to. So,
Cool. Now, we should start winding down soon, but I would really love to ask you about your art, because I think part of what makes the book and yourself so great is your attention to detail, cross-hatching, a certain evocation of mood. So I would love to just hear you talk about that, any influences or anything like that.
I started out, my artwork tended to be much more stylized, and years ago when I thought about approaching this, what became Colville, I knew that I was going to draw it in a different style. And actually, Eddie Campbell's artwork in From Hell was a big influence. And my initial thought was, I draw, and at the time I drew everything with a brush. Every line was drawn with a brush. But I knew that Eddie Campbell used, say, a crow-quill pen for his drawing and all of that cross-hatching. So one of the things I wanted to do was to draw the book with a crow-quill, a dip pen, and it would have a different look to the artwork.
I imagine it would be torture, though.
Well, I tried. It's funny. I actually tried for, not a long time, but probably for a couple of months anyway to teach myself, a technique with the crow-quill pen. And it didn't work for me. And I kind of reverted to the brush, which, a brush is maybe a simpler tool to use for, a more stylized type of artwork. But I wanted it to have this very heavy cross-hatched look to it. And, I had to draw those pages quite large to be able to get that fine of a line on the page, like using a brush to do all that cross-hatching was, like I say, in hindsight, it seemed a little bit insane at the time, but that was my technique. I approached the material knowing that I didn't want it to be stylized like my other work, that I wanted it to be more representational of, the world that I was going to be, inhabiting with these characters. It was the real world, essentially.
Well, you have certain shots where you just have full page or half page splashes of just the scenery, and to me those are like signature shots. Like when you see a certain filmmaker's films and there's certain like shots that they characteristically use, that's what I think it was used, because they sort of have this very poetic thing, whereas the storytelling pages are kind of a bit more dark or noirish or whatever.
Those pages, they just kind of, to me, they sort of happen as they come along, where, I might anticipate them a little bit. And, the only thing as far as structure that I really pay attention to is, like the page flop, for example. Which page is the reader going to be turning over to reveal the next page? And that would allow for, every once in a while I would put, say, a double page spread in. And, and I would always try to make sure that, little reveals would happen as you turn the page over. But any of those, I think there's a double page spread of Bernardo standing in the woods with his video camera. And I think that occurred just because at the moment it felt like the right thing to draw. And I didn't, like I say, I don't pre-plan much of that sort of stuff at all. It's just at the time, it felt like the right thing to do. And even some of the pages where I might have a wider, like, panoramic shot, it always just felt like, this is what I need to have to move the story along. Some of them might be, because I want to draw a side view of a car, so that needs to be a little bit more elongated, and it makes use of a wider panel better.
Sure.
Yeah.
Do you, like, you seem to draw mostly in a naturalistic vein, but I do still see a bit of that cartoonish stylishness. Like, I feel like I can see a little bit of Kim Deitch in your figures, maybe a little bit of Julie Doucette.
I love Julie Doucette's comics, and
Doucet, I should say. Sorry.
Well, and I think the world of her comics. She's up in my pantheon of great cartoonists, and Kim Deitch. I read a lot of his comics back in that formative, like 80s, early 90s period as well. But I wouldn't say, at least to my eyes, that I would have taken a huge influence from his artwork. But I do think, there's times where, maybe my cartooniness would come out at certain points. But none of it really calculated so much. It's just that's the way, I was happening to draw that day at that time.
Yeah.
There was probably pages in there where I obsessed over trying to get certain minute details as correct as I humanly could.
Right.
And then there was other times where it's like, I don't care if the inside of a car really looks like this. I'm just going to fudge it because it feels like this is the right thing to draw.
Sure. Do you find it easier to draw than write, or vice versa, or are the two just melded completely in your process?
To me, there's not really any difference between the two. I've never written a comic for somebody else, and I have always resisted having to draw somebody else's script. So I don't know much about that process.
But I was just wondering, like, do you ever just find yourself drawing and like, I got to stop and like think about the dialogue, and it's not coming so easily, whereas I can just close my eyes and draw?
Yeah, sometimes it's more of, I'll maybe know that the pacing isn't where I want it to be, or, just the interplay between, how two characters are relating to each other. But I kind of, like I say, I work it out very intuitively. I tend to labor over it until the point at which, like, actual ink is going. I hate to use whiteout. I think that there's only a tiny little couple of points where I had to white out anything. So I've tried to make sure that when I'm actually committing the dialogue and the lines to the page, that everything is final at that point. And it's all kind of the writing and drawing. It becomes the same thing. If you have a character silently walking out of his door and across the lawn and then into his truck and then driving the truck around town, well, that's the type of writing. It's a communication of information. It's communicating a certain type of mood or whatever that I'm just not using captions or dialogue or thought balloons to convey. It's hopefully moving the plot along, but also hopefully revealing, whether it's mood or some kind of gesture to the audience that, compels them to keep reading the story.
Cool. Are you working on anything right now? What's next up for you in terms of comics?
I have, I have published a second volume of the Journal of the Main Street Secret Lodge. I actually did 2 books last year. One of them was volume 2 of The Secret Lodge, which turned into a real epic. It's about 300 pages of just like a huge travelogue adventure of old-time Newmarket. I did also publish last year, and I find it tricky to talk about exactly what it is, but I published a bootleg graphic novel under a phony name that I give it away as a freebie whenever I sell a copy of one of my books. And it's actually kind of connected to Colville. It's an entirely unauthorized comic book adaptation of David Cronenberg's movie, A History of Violence.
Oh, that's interesting.
It's completely ludicrous is what it is.
Yeah.
And I love
and
that.
Totally unauthorized and bootlegged, like you said.
Well, I actually, for TCAF last year, I thought about, or a couple of years ago, I thought about putting a little zine together. And initially I wanted to do something that was just like a sketchbook series of drawings of all of the most gruesome characters from David Cronenberg movies. And that somehow evolved into, I was going to do a comic book adaptation of just the first maybe 10 minutes of A History of Violence, just as a goof off. But it was so much fun to do that I started working on it as a side project while working on the second volume of The Secret Lodge. So it was almost like a little vacation from the Secret Lodge book to do this Cronenberg book. And suddenly, it went from being a 10 or 20 page mini comic to a 140-page graphic novel, and which I then sort of tricked my printer into making copies of.
Your printer's Marquis Books, right?
They do, yeah. They've printed all of my
Quebec.
books. Yeah.
Do you find they're good? Like it's a good experience to work with them?
It's kind of interesting that when I did my first Secret Lodge volume a few years ago, initially I was looking at doing it as a print-on-demand book, and I'd heard nothing but bad stories about people and their print-on-demand graphic novels. So I started thinking, okay, I've got to do this as a proper, offset, square-bound graphic novel. And I read some article online where they actually mentioned the sales rep from the old Quebecor printing plant that I had utilized back in the 90s. And it had an email address. This was the same sales rep that I had talked to 20 years previously, and here's his email address. So I sent him an email, and it turns out he was, Quebecor had been swallowed up by another company which hadn't yet become Marquis. And they were just called Le Bon Fon, I think. And so he said, yeah, I'm still here. It's still the same crew. Do you need a quote? Mm-hmm. And it was very simple. Like I gave him my specs. I actually mailed him a graphic novel that I wanted to mimic the cover paper and the interior paper and the dimensions of. And he said, well, this is easy enough because they had printed that book. So he had all the specifications on hand. And, when he emailed me a price quote and gave me a few options for different paper stock. And it was a completely easy thing at that point. The thing that became difficult was I didn't realize how total the digital production was. Back in the old days, I literally would mail them an envelope of the original artwork. Mm-hmm. And of course they would, photograph it and make their plates and do everything old school. And of course now they said it's got to be, a digital PDF. And I can barely Google my own name, let alone scan artwork. And I don't know what PDF stands for. And I don't know how any of that works.
But maybe that's an incentive for you to learn because this is the only way for you to publish your comic.
Absolutely not. It was incentive for me to hire somebody else to do it. And thankfully, there was a couple of fits and starts where it wasn't working, but I eventually, actually, one of my customers in the store, she went to school for, digital production. And she has a scanner, she has all the software. And, so I asked her, she came into the store and I said, could you do a project like that? I said I would pay her. And she also was the person who did like the cover color separations for all of my books. I give her a very exact color template and then she'll turn it into a digital file. Mm-hmm. And she's made little tweaks here and there, say to the cover coloring on my books, but it's always looked, exactly how I think it should look in the end. And so then it was just a case of, she did all the scanning and put a file together and, somehow that gets emailed to them.
That's great, though. Did you ever think of approaching Drawn and Quarterly or Fantagraphics? Because I think with the profile you've gotten from Colville, plus the enthusiasm, and you are being published by a publisher in Italy, so why not?
I know that those guys know who I am in sort of in roundabout ways. Back in the 90s, at the behest of Seth, he had written me a letter and said...
By the way, a couple of your minor characters, like the kind of the punky youths, are called Seth and Chet.
I like to abuse Seth and Chet
I love that.
in my comics. And I did mail, this is back in the 90s, I mailed a copy of Colville and I think some of my other books to Chris Oliveros at Drawn and Quarterly. And he actually wrote back a very encouraging letter. He'd already bought a copy of Colville in Montreal at a comic store, so he was already aware of it. And basically the letter was simply, keep me in mind of anything that you're doing in the future. Mm-hmm. And of course, I didn't do anything in the future. I just stopped making comics. And it was actually really amazing. A few years ago at TCAF, I think it was the first year that I had set up there, and on the Sunday, Chris came by the table, and he actually, he had remembered my stuff from back in the day, and he wanted to buy some copies of my comics to put in the Drawn and Quarterly store in Montreal. So it was, he knew who I was, but I still didn't have any confidence in my work being a Drawn and Quarterly publication. I don't think it has what it would take to be, I hold Drawn and Quarterly and Fantagraphics in the highest possible regard as publishers.
But you're a little even more left of field. Maybe.
Yeah, I just, I about a year ago, at the encouragement of another cartoonist who said, you need to send your stuff to Eric Reynolds at Fantagraphics. And so I did. I actually got his email, and I emailed him and said, keep an eye out. I was told not to send stuff addressed to the submissions editor because they just throw that into a bucket and it never gets looked at. So I emailed him and said, is it okay to address it to you? And I mailed it off to him, and, I got a nice email back from him a few weeks later. And, there was no proposal on my part to do anything with it other than that I wanted him to know that there was yet another cartoonist out there that he should be aware of. And there's a couple of other, smaller Canadian publishers that kind of know who I am. And I have occasionally very shyly broached a topic of maybe submitting something to them. But I do like the sort of freedom and control of self-publishing.
So it's not like a Dave Sim thing where you're like, I'll, handle everything. Because...
Well, I mean, I like handling everything in a sense. I don't self-publish it as kind of a political statement. And maybe it's a misinterpretation to say that Sim was doing that at a certain point. But I like the absolute total freedom that I have to not make a concession to anybody with my work. That I do worry that if you're with a publisher, is your book going to sell enough copies to satisfy them? Obviously, they have to determine, is your work commercial enough to make them some money or break even at least for them? There's other publishers like, say, Koyama Press in Toronto, and I love their comics, but I think that my comics are totally wrong for whatever they do. Like, it just wouldn't have any place in their catalog, so I wouldn't even think of them as an option. And I don't, I think somehow, maybe with Chris Oliveros not at Drawn and Quarterly, there's a bit of a different vibe that I get off of their books.
I think things have changed, and they weren't at TCAF this year. Did you notice that?
I thought weren't they there this year? I thought there was a...
Oh, D&Q wasn't there. Which is very strange, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, sometimes it doesn't work out to be there. But I'm also, it's funny, like I actually, like I say, I really do like what they do. I love their catalog. I love their history of books. I love, like say, Fantagraphics, I think is the other company that's just head and shoulders, nothing but wonderment as far as I'm concerned of what they publish. So, maybe someday if I feel like I've got something that might be suitable for them, that I'll send it along. I am in the, I'm kind of in the stage of working on a third Secret Lodge volume, which has become sort of a much more ambitious project than I was thinking even a few months ago before starting work on it. And so it's going to be in a very different format than my previous books. I have another finished graphic novel that is in the can, I guess you'd say. And it's kind of in the vein of my Cronenberg project where, admittedly, I know that there's a temptation to assume that a bootleg unauthorized movie adaptation comic is a totally, just a creatively bankrupt avenue to go down. But I loved doing the Cronenberg book. And so I've actually completed a second graphic novel adaptation of another movie that I just absolutely loved. And I don't want to say what it is. I kind of want to leave it as a bit of a mystery because it might be... No. Well, that's actually part of the thought process that goes into it. Is The Shining is way too stylish as a film to be made into a comic book. Like my history of violence adaptation is scene for scene, word for word, everything from the movie.
I see.
It is an exact duplicate of the movie made in
That is an odd project.
And so the other one, something that I found is that, it's really impossible to do that if the movie is really
signature.
Stylish.
Yeah.
The other thing too is, like so much of cinema relies upon music to carry the cinematic experience. So I also had to look at, you can't do something that is, a Martin Scorsese movie. Well, there's so much music that carries along the tone of the film that you can't get that in an adaptation.
And
so
rhythm and editing,
Oh yeah. Everything is so stylish that it wouldn't work. And one of the things I love about Cronenberg movies was that, his movies aren't really stylish. They're very workmanlike in a way. He doesn't rely generally upon stylistic, explosive filmmaking techniques. It's like, here's the subject, and I'm putting it in the frame, and I'm going to show the audience what they need to see. There's no crazy camera angles. There's no, like I say, explosive pop music score. It's just very simple and straightforward. And it made for a very simple and straightforward adaptation. And
did you contact the filmmaker or the property holder of the film at all?
Not even in the slightest.
So,
and
it's just like the other bootleg.
It's really something that, commercially it's non-existent. That I did make copies of it, but it's purely something that I give away as a freebie. And once they're gone for good.
Right. No, it sounds intriguing.
And like I say, I think I mentioned earlier that there is a connection to Colville in it. The only thing I changed from the movie A History of Violence, I don't call the comic A History of Violence. It has a different title. It's called Hey Brohim. And also, rather than being set in like rural middle America, the comic book version is set in Colville. And all of the references are sort of Canadian geography rather than American. The movie A History of Violence was actually shot, a lot of the location work was out near Peterborough. And so it has, to me, a real Canadian vibe to it. But,
and Peterborough is beautiful. I was just there on the long weekend recently. So go on.
No, that's
like I can see that being cinematic is what I'm saying.
Yeah, and so that's kind of where I'm at now. I'm sort of sinking into another Secret Lodge comic. I've got about 40 pages, maybe 50 pages penciled. It is going to be a fairly massive undertaking. I think probably the next 2 years I'll spend working on it. I have done a couple of little mini comic projects over the last couple of years, and that's something that I've kind of rediscovered as a nice way of taking a break from a 200-page graphic novel. Is I can sit down over 10 days and draw a 20 or 30-page mini comic fairly economically. So I could see maybe doing at least one or two of those over the course of the next year or two as I slog through another muddy, historic Canadian Western saga.
Well, you had a very interesting kind of singular path and career. So to me, it's like very unpredictable, I think, where you go. So if we had this conversation in 5 years, well, even 2 years, who knows where you'll be at.
I've probably been sued by multiple film companies at that point, and I'm going
Cronenberg has personally come to take back his colors from your
flesh. My hope is that I'll have to relinquish the film rights to my Main Street Secret Lodge so that he can direct a Western before he retires. That'll be the trade-off. But I'm assuming too that I'll probably have to to get a passport because I'll go on the lam and maybe hide out in Italy and live off my Italian royalties. That's my other escape route.
That doesn't sound so bad. You just have to eat your way through, so that you could become a totally different person.
It's gonna suck big time because I'm vegan. So that would suck really large.
Well.
If you're interested in checking out Colville, email Stephen Gilbert directly at fourthdimensioncomics@gmail.com. Tell us what you think. Write us at mail@deconstructingcomics.com or contact us through social media. Find all the links on the right sidebar at deconstructingcomics.com. We're also on the Comics Podcast Network at comicspodcasts.com and on comicon.com, where our new episodes usually go up on the Friday before they appear in our feed. Also, please help us get noticed by reviewing us on Apple or any other podcast source. Tell the world why you enjoy Deconstructing Comics. Our theme is from bensound.com. 2 Patreon extras coming soon. First, Mulele, Oscar, and I discuss Solo, a Star Wars story, and the future of the Star Wars franchise. Then, my brother Paul and I chat and plan an episode of To the Batpoles immediately before recording. If these sound interesting to you, or you just like our shows and want to support them, pledge at patreon.com/deconcomics. Last Thursday on To the Batpoles, we discussed Burt Ward's 1995 memoir, Boy Wonder, My Life in Tights. The book is full of exaggerations, tall tales, and outright fibs. Is it still valuable as a work of Bat scholarship? Listen to the Batpoles in its own podcast feed on Apple Podcasts or other podcast apps. If you're looking for some constructive feedback on your comic, send it to us and Mulele and I will critique it on our spin-off podcast, Critiquing Comics. Send it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We'll read at least 30 pages of it and critique it on the show. A new episode is coming this Thursday, right here in this podcast feed. Then next week, for our 600th episode, Eugenia joins me to discuss Skydoll Sudra, the long-awaited next chapter of the Skydoll story. Also, my talk about the history of this podcast that I gave at a comics event here in Tokyo earlier this year. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.